Let's move on to the wide receiver position with some wide receiver buys for you. We got a decent list here, and I know that's typically the case with expected fantasy points. It's often the most predictive at this position. So between Pittman, Brown, Evans, Deontay, Olave, Chase, we got a bunch of guys to kind of sift through. Who are some of your favorite options, and why do you like them?
So I guess you mentioned Deontay Johnson. I guess I'm not super in love with buying him, but I just kind of wanted to point out that like he's having one of the craziest expected fantasy points seasons like since I've been doing this, which has only been this year and last year. But I don't think I've ever seen anything like 19 expected fantasy points per game for Deontay Johnson compared to 10.5 PPR points per game. He's seeing 9 targets on a roughly 10.1 ADOT, which are great numbers. Those are like near alpha number 1 wide receivers. Like all the top guys in the NFL right now are averaging like 10 to 11 targets, and Deontay's right there at 9 per game. But the efficiency's just been so bad. And he's had a couple of touchdowns that he's missed by literally like 2 inches, which if he converts those, then yeah, the numbers look a little bit better. But I think the quarterback is just so inefficient right now that I wouldn't necessarily be buying. But he is a guy that I could see turning it around at least a little bit in the second half of the year, just because that difference is just so crazy.
Absolutely. Yeah. I heard Scott Barrett talking about this, and whereas we saw like Mixon had that huge 55-point like monster regression day after all the XFP models were talking about him being a nice positive regression candidate. Deontay's kind of the receiver version of that, a player we've seen perform similar levels. He just doesn't have that quite of a ceiling of a massive takeover. But yeah, with Atlanta, the Raiders, Cleveland, like Baltimore, 2 games with them, bottom, terrible secondary there, 3rd most points allowed to wide receivers. There's definitely the matchups there too for it. So you could probably pluck him away for very cheap at this point, and all the metrics say he should turn it around big. I'm with you though. He looks so frustrated with Pickett. Like you can just see him swearing him out all the time. It's tricky because I don't believe in the QB, at least his rapport with Deontay, but all the metrics do point to a big turnaround for him. So depending on how low you can get him, I do like him as a buy low. What are some other guys on this list that you like to highlight?
So yeah, I just want to hit a few guys at once here. So the next guy would be Michael Pittman. He's averaging 18 expected fantasy points per game on 9.4 targets per game. The ADOT's a little bit lower than you'd like to see, but I think with Matt Ryan back at quarterback, then that probably has a chance to increase a little bit, at least over Ellinger. And he's averaging 13.9 points per game for a negative 4.1 point difference, which is near the bottom of the list. And generally, guys with negative difference in expected fantasy points tend to do better as they regress back towards their expected fantasy points number. So with Ryan back at quarterback, I like Pittman as a buy, depending on the price you can get him for. Kind of similar situation with Mike Evans, 17.2 expected fantasy points per game and 14.9 points per game. I think the offense should be a little bit better than the Colts offense. And I also think Mike Evans is probably the better player right now. So I would have Evans a little bit higher than Pittman, even though Pittman has slightly more expected fantasy points. And then from a non-expected fantasy points lens, AJ Brown had a really bad game in primetime last night just because the Eagles didn't possess the ball and they just kind of seemed to have an off night, which probably no one's trying to sell you AJ Brown super cheap, but I do believe in the production. His expected fantasy points, 16.4 per game, are right in line with the 16.9 points per game average that he's putting up right now. And those numbers seem to be a little bit deflated just because of that one fluky game last night. So I would expect those numbers to raise a little bit, and I would be confident in paying similar prices for AJ Brown that you were paying last week.
Yeah, I like all those guys. Pittman, as you mentioned, the low ADOT. I think he's got 1 target above 15 plus air yards on the entire year. So you got to imagine this isn't a guy that, he's no downfield burner, but he's had plenty of intermediate to those deep posts. He can get it done there. So if that just regresses even slightly more positively, and especially now that he has Matt Ryan back, his boy, the targets are there, the matchups, the schedule doesn't look too threatening the rest of the year. Yes, they have the bye in week 14, so you got to factor that in. But I like the Pittman call there, but especially the Mike Evans call. We know how good this guy is. He is just a 3-touchdown machine waiting to happen. And just a week ago should have had that 60-yard bomb. We'd be talking about like 3 straight top 15 performances had he hauled that one in. So yeah, with a couple duds in his last few, 7 and 8 points, and duds, I mean, still like not even a horrible floor. I definitely could see Cleveland, New Orleans, San Fran, Cincy, Arizona, Carolina. None of those teams are top secondaries. All of them feel ripe for Mike Evans to go off. So I like both those names to highlight as well. What is up, you fantasy wolf? Thanks so much for tuning in. If you haven't already, share your thoughts in the comments, check out some more videos, and join the newest Wolfpack by subscribing below.